Coming up on Arirang News, data shows South Korea's economy grew in the second quarter by 0.7% from the quarter before, thanks in part to consumer spending, putting it on track to grow by 4% for the year. South and North Korea restore their communication lines after an exchange of letters between their leaders. Both sides say they hope this will lead to an improvement in relations. And South Korea marks UN Forces Participation Day, an occasion to honor the sacrifices of the UN soldiers that defended South Korea in the Korean War 70 years ago. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The South Korean economy grew in the second quarter by about as much as expected, 0.7% from the quarter before. That puts it on track to grow by 4% for the year. This time, a big factor was a rise in consumer spending. Seo In-kyung reports.
The South Korean economy has posted positive growth in the second quarter of 2021. The Bank of Korea said on Tuesday that the country's second quarter real GDP growth was up 0.7% on quarter and 5.6% on year. This marks the South Korean economy's fourth consecutive quarter of growth after the pandemic led to a downturn in the first two quarters of 2020. The central bank says private consumption played a big part in the strong results as it rose by 3.5% in the second quarter, the biggest growth in 12 years. The figure was mainly led by rising spending on semi-durable goods such as clothing, as well as in the service sector, including food and accommodation. Government spending also increased by 3.9%. On the other hand, exports declined by 2%, mainly due to a decrease in automobiles and LCDs.
The contribution of private consumption to GDP growth increased while that of exports declined. Looking more closely, contribution to growth by private and government spending has increased sharply from 0.8 percentage points in the first quarter to 2.3 percentage points in the second quarter. Meanwhile, the contribution of net exports declined. This is because imports increased while exports decreased.
The economic growth in the second quarter exceeded the minimum growth rate that the country needs to achieve its 4% growth target. The central bank raised its growth forecast this year from 3% to 4% in May, based on the economic recovery up to the first quarter. Seo In-kyung, Arirang News.
Data show a rise in the number of older Koreans in the workforce between the ages of 55 and 79. According to Statistics Korea, in May, the workforce in that age group grew by 381,000. Overall, the proportion of people that age with jobs rose to 56%, an increase on year of 0.7 percentage points. More were looking for work as well. 21% said they'd looked for a job in the previous 12 months, an on-year increase of 2 percentage points. Around 2/3 said they'd had at least one job in that period. Some of South Korea's biggest companies have started administering coronavirus vaccines to their employees at their in-house clinics. In addition to the overall vaccine effort, they want to make sure that workers are vaccinated in sectors that are essential to the Korean economy. Min Soo-kyun reports.
Major companies in South Korea have started inoculating their employees with Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine. Hyundai Heavy Industries said on Tuesday it's vaccinating employees aged 18 to 59 working at its Ulsan plant, with priority given to those in their 50s. The company says that workers from partner firms dispatched to the Ulsan plant can also receive shots. Among the roughly 30,000 employees at the plant, more than 66% have signed up. Samsung Electronics is taking similar steps, vaccinating employees at its facilities, including Suwon, Gumi, Gwangju, and Gihung. Other companies such as SK Hynix and LG Display have also launched their in-house vaccinations. A total of 43 firms with in-house medical clinics are taking part, providing jabs for more than 300,000 workers. First shots will be given this week and the second shots will start mid-August. The plan is partly to prevent the disruption of key industries amid the fourth wave of the pandemic.
The government is working with local businesses to launch vaccination programs at large manufacturing plants in order to maintain the production of key items and boost exports.
It's also part of the country's efforts to ramp up vaccinations as South Korea aims to inoculate more than 70% of the population by November.
Favorable outcomes are expected through this, as it can reduce the workload for vaccination centers and make vaccines available for more workers.
So far, about 13% of the population have been fully vaccinated, and more than 33% have received at least one dose of the COVID-19 vaccine. Min Suk-hyun, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Mr. Daniel Yu, Global Strategist at Yuanta Securities. Mr. Yu, good afternoon. Thanks for coming on today.
Good afternoon.
Well, stocks on Wall Street overnight started out a little uncertain, but in the end closed at new highs as investors looked to earnings from big tech. Tesla was one company that reported earnings after the close, and its stock is moving higher. What's the story in the global markets, and what do you see ahead?
Yes, if you look at the U.S. market, it continues to break its record. If you look at the Dow Jones, it was up 0.24%. S&P was also up the same. And NASDAQ was slightly up by 0.03%. And small cap also went up by about 0.29%. There are continuation of some kind of volatility happening in the market, but nevertheless, if you look at the U.S. market, it is rising because of the strong earnings. So far, more than 24% of S&P 500 released earnings, and the results coming out that more than 88% of the companies are releasing better than expected EPS, and also the sales number is actually 86% of the company that released the results came in better than expectations. So due to this type of strong earnings and that economic recovery is continued to be happening, we are seeing U.S. market continue to do well. However, if you look at the other countries, such as the G2 of China, it fell significantly today. The Shanghai was down by 2.5%, and Shenzhen index was down by 3.7%. Obviously, heavy regulatory issues by the Chinese government on the big tech companies and various other large caps has resulted into significant correction. And that seems to be lingering around for the overall market right now. U.S. futures market is also down slightly, somewhere between around 0.2 to 0.5% right now, depending on the index. But in any case, clearly people are quite worried about what's happening to China. In terms of the economic growth number for China, it is slowing down, but we were hoping for continued boosting measure by the government. But this type of regulatory environment or regulatory issues comes through, then that is definitely negative news for the economic pickup that we were hoping to see. All in all, I think that there's a quite discrepancy between U.S. versus China, where U.S. is doing very well versus China seems to be in an area where uncertainty lingers at this point in time.
Well, here in Korea, stocks were higher today too, or on the main Kospi index at least. Foreign investors and institutions net buying, and retail investors seeing a chance to maybe take some profits. A little lower though on the Kosdaq. Tell us about the domestic market.
Right. At the beginning of today, it did quite well, and it was up close to almost 1% for Kospi, but it kind of lingered down to only rising by about 0.24% for Kospi. And also, actually, the Kosdaq turned negative, and it fell by about 0.1%. In terms of the foreign investors, they bought slightly of 44.7 billion, and the institutional investors were net buyer of 225 billion or so, whereas the retail investors were net sellers. Obviously, the Chinese market crash that we saw today has negatively affected the Korean equity market towards the end of the session. Clearly, there's uncertainty regarding what's happening to China. But in terms of the economic number, though, we are seeing very strong numbers coming through for Korea, as well as the earnings numbers that are coming through are looking very good. So therefore, we think that Korean equity market would be a bit of a distance from what's happening to China, and that the valuations are extremely attractive at the current point in time. And if the regulatory environment puts negative impact on the Chinese competitors, then it is definitely positive news for Korea companies. So we don't think that that will have a significant impact for Korean equity market. In any case, right now, people are a bit confused right now that index is still lingering around 3,200 to 3,250 range. We don't think that this thing's going to change significantly unless we continue to see U.S. Equity market continue to rise and China stabilizes. And by the time of some July and August numbers of inflations, it comes to say stabilizations, then we think that Korea can do further rise. But for the time being, it seems to be needing some kind of breathing time for now.
Well, if we could take a closer look at one company, SK Hynix, that's Korea's second biggest chip maker. Revenue in the second quarter, they're rising to 10 trillion won at that level for the first time in 3 years. That's around $9 billion, give or take. Operating profit was up quite a bit to around $2.5 billion, but still a little short of market expectations. What's happening at SK Hynix, and what can we expect better in the second half of the year?
Right. I think that this explains exactly what's happening to the Korean equity market. The results came out for SK Hynix. It came out so well, so good. But the stock price were down by slightly less than 1%, but still was down. I think that people are confused whether to sell it into the news or whether to buy with the strong earnings and expected earnings to be further better in third quarter. I think that people are quite confused. But I must say that the results of SK Hynix are phenomenally good. If you look at the numbers, the second quarter net income stood at 1.98 trillion. That's about $1.7 billion US, and that's up 56.5% from a year earlier. And also, if you look at the operating profit, it was up 38.3% year on year, reaching 2.7 trillion won. Also, sales increase was phenomenal that it showed almost 20% increase in second quarter. Clearly, the numbers are continue to do well even on the quarter-on-quarter basis. From the first quarter to the second quarter, net profit was up 100%. Operating income was up 103.5%. Sales increase was 21.5%. So definitely, we are seeing the numbers are looking very strong. Hynix is saying that the DRAM bit growth in second quarter, it's coming in at about a mid-single-digit percentage range. And even for the NAND flash, they're saying that ASP is improving by about 10%. All in all, the demand for the DRAM and NAND are very strong at the current point in time. And also, Hynix is expecting that the server DRAM demand to pick up towards the end of third quarter to the even first quarter of next year. So in terms of cyclicality of SK Hynix and DRAM market, we don't think that it's over. The earnings numbers were probably the record highest number, and that the growth rate will slow down in third quarter. But nevertheless, Hynix is generating operating profit margin of 51% and the sales growth rate of 20%. And if you add those two up, that's more than 70%. And that means there's no reason for this kind of company trading at only 1.8 times sales. We think that this kind of earnings would be fitting into the equity market as the third quarter comes and we don't see, say, weakening of the earnings that much, then we think that the market can do further rise. I think that applies for most of the other companies as well in Korea, I guess particularly for all the semiconductor-related companies, including Samsung Electronics.
Well, we look forward to watching the semiconductor sector in particular with you, Mr. Yu. And now zooming out a bit in the second quarter, as I mentioned before, data showed the Korean economy growing by 0.7%, about as much as expected, and also saw the biggest rise in private consumption in over a decade and the biggest in government spending since the 1980s. What do you make of this data from the Bank of Korea?
Obviously, these numbers are looking fairly good. As you said, it's up 0.7% quarter-on-quarter basis. But that's slightly declining from 1.7% growth in the previous period. But obviously, that's because you had a very weak, obviously, numbers are coming through due to the pandemics. But it's still continue to grow. I think if you look at it on a basis of year-on-year number, that is 5.9% year-on-year. That is strong, significantly higher than the previous quarter of 1.9%. So as the year-on-year growth rate continues to rise, we think that quarter number will be the record high number for at least for the several years, and then it will slow down. But nevertheless, Korea in a good position to continue to grow somewhere between 2 to 3% real growth rate of economic growth rate over the longer period of time. If you look at the numbers, the private consumption was growing quite nicely at 3.5% as expenditures on semiconductor durables, goods, and services increased. And also government expenditures were rising by 3.9%. Regarding the net trade, though, export declined while the import increased. So the impact of the net export to the GDP growth rate slowed down. But in all, we are seeing continued strong export, continued strong consumption numbers, and Korea being highly dependent on global consumer market, particularly for U.S. and China. We think that these numbers from these both countries will be strong going forward, and that means that Korea's economic numbers should be reasonably good. So having said that, economic numbers and earnings numbers are in favor of Korean equity market further in a longer term basis. We think that equity market correction that we've been seeing or slowdown that we've been seeing is not going to last for a very long period of time. I think that by sometime in August, we will see Korean equity market moving further with the good economic numbers and earnings.
Got it. All right, Mr. Yu, we'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you, as always, for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
In Olympic fencing, the South Korean women's epee team have made it to the finals, meaning a possible gold medal for them tonight, but at least a silver. On the team are Song Se-ra, Choi In-jung, and Kang Yong-mi. In the semifinal this afternoon, they beat the world's top-ranked team, China, 39-28. They'll face Estonia for the gold medal this evening at 7:30 Korea time. In the London Olympics in 2012, the Korean women's team won silver in this event. Earlier in the day, 18-year-old South Korean swimmer Hwang Sun-woo fell just short of a medal in the men's 200-meter freestyle. He finished 7th in the final with a time of 1 minute 45.26 seconds. It was an agonizing end, Hwang having been in the lead until the 150-meter mark. The gold went to Britain's Tom Dean. Hopes were high for Hwang, who was the first South Korean to make the final since Park Tae-hwan in 2012. But Hwang has a couple more chances left in the 50 and the 100-meter freestyle. The heats for the 100 meters start tonight at 7 p.m. and the 50-meter heats are on Friday. In pistol shooting, South Korean four-time gold medalist Jin Jong-oh will be leaving the games without a medal this time. He and his teammate Chu Ga-eun failed to make it out of today's first qualification round of the mixed team 10-meter air pistol event. And so he'll leave empty-handed, having also failed to qualify for the finals of the men's individual event last Saturday. Jin holds multiple world records in pistol shooting. With a medal at this Olympics, he could have become South Korea's most decorated Olympian of all time, overtaking the women's archery legend Kim Sun-young, who's tied with Jin at 6 medals. This could be Jin's last time at the Games, but speaking to Yonhap News after the loss, he said he isn't ready to talk about retirement. In what could be a big step forward in cross-border relations, South and North Korea have reopened their communication lines. It had been more than a year since North Korea cut off those lines unilaterally. The Blue House in Seoul says President Moon and North Korea's Kim Jong-un had exchanged letters and agreed to restore communications and improve ties. Kim Min-ji has the details.
South and North Korea have restored key cross-border communication lines some 13 months after Pyongyang unilaterally severed them. The Blue House said Tuesday that the leaders of the two Koreas had exchanged multiple letters since April, in which they discussed restoring relations.
The leaders of South and North Korea have exchanged personal letters on multiple occasions since April regarding the restoration of ties, and in the process agreed to reopen the severed communication lines.
The communication lines that have been reopened are the ones overseen by the military and the Unification Ministry. The hotline between the leaders is yet to be restored. The Blue House said that in their letters, the leaders shared an understanding of the need to develop inter-Korean ties and restore mutual trust at an early date for peace on the Korean peninsula. In June last year, North Korea cut all cross-border communication and blew up the Inter-Korean Liaison Office in protest against propaganda leaflets sent by activists that it said Seoul had failed to stop. North Korea also confirmed that the lines were restored, saying this will play a positive role in improving relations. The North Korean Central News Agency said that the whole Korean nation desires to see relations recover from recent setbacks and stagnation. Coincidence may be, but the reopening came on the 68th anniversary of the Korean War Armistice Agreement, the truce that halted active combat. The move is expected to give President Moon Jae-in some room to get his peace initiative going again. Inter-Korean relations have been at a standstill since the North Korea-US summit in early 2019 ended without a deal. Focus will be on how much progress can be made going forward, as President Moon is running short on time with less than 10 months left in office. Options could include a summit, albeit virtually, between the two leaders. The Blue House says such matters have not been discussed, but that it will continue to make efforts to improve relations. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
And South Korea today is celebrating UN Forces Participation Day to honor the sacrifices made by the UN troops who defended the country in the Korean War 70 years ago. President Moon Jae-in also announced state honors for 2 individual soldiers for their sacrifices. Kim Ji-yeon reports.
Marking UN Forces Participation Day and the 68th anniversary of the signing of the Armistice Agreement, South Korea remembers the heroic efforts of United Nations troops to defend the country during the Korean War. At a ceremony held at Cheongwade on Tuesday, President Moon Jae-in awarded state medals to 2 veterans for their sacrifices, late Father Emil Joseph Kapoon from the U.S. and retired Australian Brigadier General Colleen Nicholas Khan. The medals were received by their family members. It's the first time that a South Korean president has directly handed out the medals to mark the occasion.
유엔은 창설 이후 처음으로 한국 전쟁에 참전해 연대와 협력이 한 나라의 자유와 평화를 지킬 수 있다는 것을 세계 역사에 깊이 각인했습니다. 자유와 평화를 수호한 두 분의 정신이 우리 국민의 마음속에 영원히 기억되길 바랍니다.
Kapoon, a former captain of the U.S. Cavalry Division, was awarded the Taeguk Order of Military Merit. He was renowned for boosting morale among prisoners of war and passed away in prison. His remains, which were found in March, were repatriated to his family members. Former Army Brigadier General Khan of the Royal Australian Regiment was awarded the National Medal of Merit Pomegranate. After his return to Australia, he took on the role of a private ambassador to educate people of the hardships of the Korean War and the rebuilding of Korea after the war. UN Forces Participation Day was created in 2013 to honor the nearly 2 million troops from 22 countries who fought alongside South Korea under the UN flag. President Moon said South Korea will repay the veterans through unity and cooperation with the world to overcome the pandemic. Kim Ji-yeon, Arirang News.
And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.